Astra stood before the floor-to-ceiling window, her forehead pressed hard against the glass. The surface was biting, a sharp, steady cold that seeped into her skin and anchored her to the spot. Outside, the city was waking up, but it felt miles away, a silent film playing behind a transparent wall. The morning light was thin and gray, washing out the streets and turning the distant buildings into jagged, indistinct shapes. She did not move. She watched the horizon, waiting for the first real sign of life to break the monotony of the dawn. There was a profound distance between her and the world beyond the pain, a gap that felt wider with every breath she took. She pulled her hand back, leaving a faint, fading fog on the surface where her palm had been. The room behind her was still. She remained there, a solitary figure framed by the vast, indifferent glass, watching the world begin its day without her. Below, the sidewalk became a narrow river of movement. Astra tracked a man in a dark coat, his pace erratic, his eyes fixed on the pavement. He reached into his pocket, fumbled, and his briefcase hit the concrete with a sharp, hollow thud. Papers spilled out, catching the wind. He stopped, his shoulders hunching toward his ears, his face twisted, a raw, jagged mask of frustration that stood out against the gray morning. He kicked the briefcase, a sharp, sudden motion that sent a tremor through the glass against Astra's forehead. She watched him hover there, caught in the grip of his own internal noise. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, his expression smoothed. He gathered the papers, stacked them with mechanical precision, and stood upright. The tension drained from his posture, replaced by a rigid, practiced calm. He stepped back into the flow of the crowd, disappearing into the blur of commuters. Astra remained motionless, her breath hitching as she processed the sudden shift. She watched the spot where he had stood, now empty, and felt the heavy, silent weight of being the only one who had seen the crack in his composure. Astra pulled her hand away from the glass. The cold spot on the pane faded, leaving only a faint, lingering smudge. She turned, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she were still shaking off the weight of the city below. The room was no longer empty. Sol stood near the doorway, his presence a sudden, sharp contrast to the stillness she had cultivated. He had not made a sound upon entering. His arrival was marked only by the subtle displacement of air and the way the shadows in the corner seemed to shift. He moved forward, stopping a few paces behind her. Astra did not look at the window again. She fixed her gaze on him, searching his face for a reflection of the restlessness that had been building in her chest for weeks. The silence between them stretched, heavy and expectant. She finally spoke, her voice steady but thin, cutting through the quiet of the apartment. "Everything feels different now," she said. "I am standing between two lives." She looked down at her hands, then back at him, her eyes wide and searching. "One where I just watch, and one where I am finally part of the current." Sol did not look away. He gestured toward the window, his hand tracing the path of the city traffic below. "You have spent your life reacting to the world," he said, his voice low and even. "But there is another way. You can choose your place in it." Astra turned back to the glass, her fingers tracing the cold surface. The city moved in a blur of gray, a relentless, grinding noise. She felt the sudden, sharp urge to break the pattern. She gripped the edge of the windowsill, her fingers locking tight. The wood bit into her palms, and she felt the pressure mount until her knuckles turned white. Her breath came in short, jagged bursts. She did not look back at him. "I am tired of just understanding the noise," she said, her voice tight with a rising, restless energy. "I have spent years listening to the hum of the city, watching the cracks form in everyone else and doing nothing." She squeezed the ledge harder. "I want to do something with it. I want to be the one who changes the frequency." She finally turned to face him, her eyes burning. Astra did not wait for his reply. She turned toward the door, her stride purposeful and quick. The heavy oak frame clicked shut behind her, sealing the quiet of the apartment away. She descended the stairs, her boots hitting the concrete with a rhythm that felt entirely new. When she stepped out onto the sidewalk, the city hit her like a physical wave. The air was thick with the scent of wet asphalt and burnt coffee, a chaotic symphony of motion that usually made her retreat. Today, she did not flinch. She pushed into the flow of the morning commute, weaving through the mass of people. As she moved, the air around her began to behave strangely. She felt a faint, hum-like pressure building in her palms, a static charge that rippled outward with every step she took. People veered away from her path without looking, their shoulders dropping as she passed. She stopped at a street corner, watching the traffic light pulse from red to green. The subway entrance swallowed her, a concrete throat pulling the city downward. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of ozone and damp stone. Astra moved with the current of commuters, her boots echoing against the tiled walls. A high-pitched whine of brakes screeched through the station, vibrating in her teeth. She navigated the turnstile and pushed toward the platform, but the flow of the crowd suddenly buckled. People swerved, eyes averted, moving around a singular point of friction. Astra slowed, her gaze locking onto a man slumped against a rusted support pillar. His hands were clawed into his chest, his knuckles white against the dark metal of his briefcase. His breath came in ragged, wet gasps that cut through the station noise. He was drowning in plain sight. Astra stopped dead. The crowd surged past, a river of indifference, but she remained anchored. She felt the static in her palms flare, a hot, pulsing rhythm that matched the frantic cadence of the man's breathing. She took a half step forward, the decision settling in her chest like lead. The air between them thickened, vibrating with the sudden, sharp focus of her intent. She did not look away. She braced her feet, drew a slow, deliberate breath, and reached out with her mind to meet the chaos. Astra stood motionless, her feet planted firmly on the grime-streaked platform. She did not speak. She did not reach out with her hands. She simply breathed, pulling the frantic, jagged energy of the station into her own center and smoothing it out. The air between them, previously thick with the man's panic, began to thin. The man's shoulders, hunched and trembling against the pillar, slowly dropped. His fingers, which had been clawed into his chest, uncurled. The ragged, wet gasps that had cut through the station noise slowed, deepening into a rhythmic, steady hum. He stopped shaking. Astra held her focus, feeling the static in her palms dissipate as the man's pulse synchronized with her own. He blinked, his eyes losing their glassy, unfocused stare. He looked at his hands, then at the station floor, and finally up at Astra. He was confused, his brow furrowed, but the terror had vanished from his face. He leaned his head back against the cold stone of the pillar, exhaling a long, shaky breath. He whispered, "I do not know why, but I feel better." Astra did not reply. She watched the tension drain from his frame. Astra turned away before the man could ask another question. She walked fast, her boots clicking sharply against the concrete, the sound echoing into the tunnel. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She shoved her hands deep into her pockets, but the feeling remained a faint, electric hum that buzzed against her palms. She reached the stairs and climbed, her legs heavy, each step feeling more deliberate than the last. The city above was no longer just a blur of gray light. Every face she passed seemed to carry a weight she could now identify. A woman clutching a bag, a man staring blankly at a storefront. She saw the jagged, frantic energy radiating from them like heat haze. It was everywhere. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She had not just healed a stranger. She had opened a door that could not be closed. The responsibility pressed down on her shoulders, a cold, invisible burden. She stopped at the top of the stairs, leaning against the cold brick of the building exterior, and pressed her palms flat against the stone. The city noise roared around her, no longer a chaotic mess, but a chorus of silent, desperate calls. She looked down at her hands, trembling slightly, and understood that the quiet life she had known was gone. Astra found a wooden bench tucked away in a quiet corner of the park. She did not sit. Instead, she began to pace the short stretch of gravel path, her boots scuffing the stones with a harsh, rhythmic crunch that grated against her nerves. She stopped, turned, and paced back again, her fingers twisting together until the skin went white. The park was still, but her mind was a storm of jagged edges. She looked at the empty space beside the bench, imagining the weight of another person in need, and felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. What if she reached out, and the energy did not flow? What if she tried to bridge the gap and only made the suffering worse? She stopped pacing and kicked at a loose stone, watching it skitter into the grass. The silence of the park felt heavy, expectant, and suffocating. She pressed her palms against the rough wood of the bench, feeling the splinters bite into her skin, trying to ground herself. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts. If she stepped forward into this, and she failed, what would be left of the person she used to be? Astra spun on her heel, her boots grinding into the gravel, ready to pace the path again. She did not hear him approach. The crunch of stones behind her stopped, and the air in the small clearing seemed to thin, turning sharp and cold. She froze, her breath hitching in her throat. Saul stood at the edge of the path, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his coat. He did not move to comfort her. He did not offer a gentle smile. He watched her with a stillness that made her skin prickle. Astra opened her mouth to speak, to voice the fear that had been gnawing at her, but the words died in her throat. Saul stepped forward, his eyes locking onto hers with a weight that felt like iron. He spoke, his voice low and devoid of pity. "You will fail." The words hung in the damp air, heavy and absolute. Astra felt the blood drain from her face. She stopped moving entirely, her jaw dropping. The park seemed to tilt. She stared at him, her hands hanging limp at her sides, unable to look away from the cold, unyielding truth in his gaze. Astra stood motionless, the gravel biting into the soles of her boots. The air felt thin, stripped of all warmth. She waited for a retraction, a softening, but Saul remained as rigid as the trees surrounding them. He took a slow step toward her, his gaze never wavering. When he spoke again, his voice lacked the sharp edge of his previous statement. "Purpose is not perfection," he said, his hands still deep in his pockets. "It is alignment." Astra blinked, the words landing like stones in a still pond. She looked at his face, searching for a sign of mockery, but found only a cold, focused intent. He turned his back to her and began walking toward the edge of the park, his gait measured and deliberate. Astra hesitated, then followed. The transition from the open park to the narrow, shadowed streets felt like moving through a physical barrier. Every step she took away from the bench felt like shedding a layer of her previous hesitation. He pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in the quiet street. Astra crossed the threshold, her heart hammering against her ribs, ready to face the weight of what he was about to demand. The workspace was cool, the air stagnant and heavy with the scent of old paper. Saul moved to the center of the room, his footsteps muffled by the dust on the floorboards. He stopped at the heavy wooden table and pulled a chair back, the wood scraping harshly against the floor. Astra watched from the doorway, her hands gripping the frame. Saul reached into his coat and pulled out a leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth by years of use. He laid it flat on the table with a soft, final thud. Next, he produced a thick candle, setting it upright beside the book. He struck a match, the flare of light momentarily blinding in the dim room, and pressed the flame to the wick. A thin ribbon of smoke curled upward. Finally, he placed a small, blank stone on the table. It was gray, perfectly smooth, and cold to the touch. Saul stepped back, his hands resting on the edge of the table, his eyes fixed on the three items. The journal, the flame, and the stone sat in a triangle of light, their shadows stretching long and distorted against the wall. The room felt smaller now, the space between Astra and the table charged with a sudden, suffocating gravity. She took a hesitant step forward, the floorboards groaning under her weight. Astra reached the table, the wood cool and hard beneath her fingertips. She looked at the journal, the candle, and the stone, their presence anchoring the room in a sudden, sharp clarity. Sol stood opposite her, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes unblinking. He gestured to each item in turn, his voice a low, steady pulse in the quiet space. Healer, creator, guide, observer, he listed, the words hanging in the air like physical weights. Astra felt the floor tilt beneath her. She looked at him, her chest tight, her voice barely rising above the sound of the flickering flame. "Which one am I?" She asked the question, but it felt like a plea. For an answer she was terrified to give herself. Sol did not offer comfort. He did not offer a map. Instead, he reached out and slid the leather-bound journal across the grain of the table until it rested directly under her hands. The leather was rough, cold, and heavy. He pulled his hand back, leaving her alone with the object. The silence between them stretched, thick and demanding. Astra pulled the chair out, the sound sharp and sudden in the quiet room. She sat, the wood hard against her back, and placed both hands flat on the table. The surface was cool, grounding her pulse. She reached out, her fingers brushing the blank stone. It was heavy, dense, and unyielding. She closed her eyes, shutting out the shadows on the walls and the steady gaze of the man across from her. She focused entirely on the sensation of the stone beneath her palm, feeling its weight as a physical anchor for her intent. The room seemed to hold its breath. She took a long, slow inhalation, letting the air fill her lungs until her chest felt tight. When she opened her eyes, the tremor in her hands had vanished. She looked at the journal, then at the stone, and finally met the eyes of the man who had brought her to this edge. "I do not need to be everything," she declared, her tone firm and final. "But I will be something real. I choose to use what I feel to help, not to hide." The words hung in the air, solid and unchangeable. She felt the shift in her own posture, the way her shoulders squared and her grip on the table tightened. The final word left her lips, and the room seemed to contract. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of her own steady breathing. Then, the candle flame, previously a thin, wavering sliver of orange, surged. It did not merely grow. It expanded, pushing outward in a sudden, violent bloom of golden light. The wick crackled, a sharp, dry sound that echoed off the walls. Astra watched as the light caught the edge of the leather journal, turning the grain into a landscape of deep, rich shadows and brilliant highlights. The golden glow washed over the table, illuminating the blank stone until it seemed to pulse with a soft, internal warmth. She did not pull back. She held her position, her palms still pressed flat against the wood, feeling the heat from the flare radiate across her skin. The light climbed the walls, chasing the darkness into the corners, turning the workspace into a pocket of intense, concentrated clarity. Every object on the table now stood in sharp relief, defined by the new, steady radiance. The air itself felt different, thick with the weight of her decision. Astra watched the flame dance, its movement no longer erratic, but rhythmic and controlled. Sol stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the walls where the golden light now traced intricate patterns. He watched the illumination dance, its movement fluid and deliberate, casting long, sweeping shadows that shifted with every pulse of the flame. The room, once defined by its dim corners and muted tones, was now saturated with a steady, vibrant glow. He tracked the way the light caught the dust motes in the air, turning them into suspended sparks that drifted slowly through the space. He did not look at Astra. He watched the environment she had fundamentally altered. The air felt charged, vibrating with a low, hum-like intensity. Sol turned his head, his eyes reflecting the golden radiance as he finally looked toward her. He gestured to the walls, the ceiling, and the way the light now clung to every surface. "That choice changes everything," he said, his voice low but carrying clearly through the transformed space. "Energy follows a decision." He watched the light settle into a rhythmic, steady rhythm, confirming the permanence of the shift. The workspace was no longer just a room. It was a manifestation of her intent. The golden glow held its shape for a moment longer, a steady beacon in the center of the workspace. Then, the air in the room underwent a violent transformation. A sharp, biting cold swept through the space, moving with the force of an open door in a winter gale. The temperature plummeted, turning the warmth of the room into a memory. Astra felt the change instantly. The heat that had radiated from the table vanished, replaced by a stinging chill that settled against her skin. On the table, the candle flame, which had been burning with a rhythmic golden pulse, reacted as if struck. It sputtered, its base narrowing into a thin, frantic needle of light. The flame began to whip back and forth, tearing at the wick as if trying to escape the encroaching frost. It turned a pale, sickly blue, casting jagged, erratic shadows. The golden radiance that had defined the room was shredded, replaced by a flickering, unstable light that struggled to maintain its hold. The air grew heavy, thick with a sudden, oppressive pressure that made the very act of breathing feel labored. Astra watched the flame fight for survival, its light dimming and flaring in a desperate, uneven rhythm. The workspace now felt exposed, the boundaries of her control breached. Sol did not reach for the candle. Instead, he turned his head toward the heavy wood of the door, his jaw tightening into a hard, rigid line. The flickering light cast deep, hollow shadows across his face, stripping away the warmth of his earlier expression. He looked at the threshold as if he could see through the solid barrier, his eyes narrowing in sharp, focused scrutiny. The air in the room grew thin, vibrating with a low-frequency hum that rattled the glass of the window. Sol spoke, his voice cutting through the silence. "When you step into purpose, not everything that finds you will be light." The warning hung in the air, cold and absolute. Astra felt a sudden, sharp draft crawl up her spine, a sensation like ice water trailing across her skin. It was not just a change in temperature. She turned slowly, her gaze locked on the door, watching the shadows stretch and warp across the floorboards. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in as the golden glow from the candle finally gave way to a dim, gray twilight. The silence that followed was heavy. Astra felt the cold draft crawl up her spine, a sharp, biting sensation that made her skin prickle. She looked at the door, then back at Sol. The shadows in the room deepened, but she did not retreat. She stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the hardwood, and squared her shoulders. Her breath hitched, then leveled out into a steady, controlled rhythm. "Then I will learn to face it," she said, her voice cutting through the oppressive silence. She held her ground, her gaze fixed on the threshold, refusing to look away from the encroaching dark. Sol watched her, his expression shifting. He offered a brief, grim movement of his lips, a smile that held no warmth, only a hard, sharp acknowledgement of the path ahead. "You will," he replied. The candle on the table gave one final, violent flicker before steadying into a thin, unwavering point of light. Astra remained still, her hands balled into fists at her sides.